Hi, I'm Adam Geis.
I'm David Lurch.
We're hosts of the EdTech Distilled podcast, which is a part of the Education Podcast Network.
Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Teaching While Queer is a podcast for 2S LGBTQ+ educational professionals to share their experiences in academia. Hi, I'm your host, Brian Stanton, a theater pedagogue and educator in New York City, and my goal is to share stories from around the world from 2S LGBTQ+ educators. I hope you enjoy Teaching While Queer. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Teaching While Queer. I am your host, Brian Stanton. My pronouns are he and they. I would like to take this opportunity to interview someone that I actually have the privilege of working with right now through an LGBTQ cohort. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But this is SJ Janjua. So sorry. I have a cold right now, everyone, so I'm like breaking up my words here. SJ, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. So happy to be here with you today, Brian, to talk a little bit more about teaching while queer and all that encompasses. My name is SJ Janjua. My pronouns are they, them. And I am the founder and consultant of Empowered for Equity Consulting. And I work with K through 12 schools and queer educators on DEI topics, mostly working with other teachers and administrators on creating more inclusive environments for LGBTQ plus youth.
I love that. I'm a huge fan of your work. I don't know if you all have noticed, but we definitely share each other's Instagram stuff. So if you are a listener and you are on my Instagram, then you'll have to check out their Instagram as well. Anywho, let's not talk about Instagram. Let's talk about you. Let's go on a journey back in time. Can you tell me what life was like for you as a queer youth?
Totally. Yeah. So I didn't come out as queer or trans and non-binary until later in life. But I definitely always kind of felt like there was something different about me. I didn't really relate to my peers as much when I was young. I also grew up in a mixed race household. My dad is from Pakistan. My mom is from rural Missouri. So as you can imagine, that was an experience in and of itself. And I'm a middle child. I have two siblings. And so life growing up was a lot of moving around. I think I moved 8 times in the span of my childhood. My dad's a very ambitious person, and so was always kind of chasing his next dream. And so we moved around a lot. I lived in all kinds of different places within the US, and I was always the new kid, which was really hard for me because I'm not as much anymore, but when I was younger, I was super shy. And I'm very introverted. I was kind of a bookworm. And it was really difficult for me to make friends as I was moving, and I was always the new kid everywhere that I went. And so I ended up forming bonds with my teachers in a different way. And so that kind of led me later in life to wanting to be a teacher, but also I also just felt really invisible in school and kind of felt like I didn't really know where I fit there. And I think a lot of that had to do with my queerness and my transness, even though I couldn't really put those words, together with how I was feeling at the time. I think I just felt like nobody really saw me for who I was. And so that was really alienating and isolating. I was a really good student. I made really good grades and I really loved learning. But I was also an athlete. I played a lot of different sports. So that was kind of where I channeled a lot of that energy into was excelling in those ways. And kind of these feelings I was having about my gender and my sexuality. I kind of just ignored them or kind of pushed them down because I didn't really know how to deal with that at the time and didn't know how my parents would react to those types of things. And I definitely knew queer kids in high school, but they got bullied a lot, and it just didn't seem like it would have been an okay situation for me to come out at that time. And I was still kind of figuring things out. So I didn't come out until much later, but I think I've always known these things about myself, but it just, I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't have the full understanding of what these things were yet.
For sure. Absolutely. And I think that there's so many of us that kind of have that same story, especially, people of a certain age, mainly people who grew up in an age where the vocabulary didn't exist or wasn't available to us. So there are a couple of things in an intersectionality that I find fascinating is that you mentioned that you're the child of, an immigrant parent, and that your dad was constantly chasing his new dream. And it just makes me think about that, American dream that people strive for. And it's like a sales pitch to those who are immigrating here. And so that kind of intersectionality coupled with this moving around and queerness makes your story just such an interesting journey. Because I think so many people have been sold on this idea that we have to like pursue this American dream, and you kind of watch somebody do that. And I'm intrigued to see if you think that played much into kind of your own experience as you became an adult.
Totally. Yeah. And when my dad immigrated to the US in the 80s, and he came here with his brother, went to college here, and his dream was always to be a CEO of a company. He really wanted to reach that, and he eventually did, but it took him a lot of climbing up the ladder to get there, and so that's what kind of moved us around a lot. But when he moved here, I don't know if someone told him, or before he left Pakistan, if someone told him about assimilation and how important that would be for him to really survive here, because he really didn't share his culture with us at all when I was growing up. And even now, he grew up Muslim and didn't end up really practicing at all when he moved here. He definitely tried to Americanize himself to be able to survive here. And so that is definitely something that has been difficult for me as I've grown older, is really being disconnected from half of who I am culturally. And so as an adult, I've really had to make up a lot of lost time in terms of learning about Pakistani culture, learning about South Asian culture, and how that factors into the rest of my life, and things of that nature. But I'm also a super ambitious person, and I always have been. And I think that has been really ingrained in me and my siblings since we were really young. My mom came from not a wealthy family, a family that grew up, middle class, but also her parents were very poor when they were growing up. So she didn't have a ton when she was growing up. And I think something that both of our parents have in common is that they wanted more for us. And they wanted to be able to make the sacrifices necessary to provide a better life for their kids. And so I think that's something that has been ingrained in me too, is that sometimes sacrifices have to be made to be able to get to where you want to be in life, and that it's good to be ambitious. I grew up in a household where my parents were very strict about grades and school and education, and there was no not going to college. That was they were you're going to college, there's no other option. That's what you're going to do, and you're going to get a job and, do that. And that's what you're going to do. And so I definitely think that the ambition from both of my parents really was ingrained at a young age for me. And I definitely still see it within me today.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said about, I don't know, late boomers, early Gen X parents
Mm-hmm.
who are middle class,
Yeah.
who have that desire, because I know my parents were very much like, we want you all to be better and have better
Mm-hmm.
lives than us. And that's always been the thing. Now they call us jerks because we quote unquote think we're better than everybody else. And I was like, well, we were trained. But I think it's so fascinating because I think part of it is generational, and then part
Mm-hmm.
of it comes from that like American dream standpoint, because I also think that that was heavy that during that time, like when our parents were younger,
Mm-hmm.
for your mom and my parents, when they were younger, like that was a heavy thing that was being sold, this
Yeah.
idea of American dream. And now I think people are more cynical about it, and so there's a deeper understanding that not all dreams are realistic. And also, like, how do you have 2.5 kids or whatever?
Yeah.
So I will take an arm and a leg and half a head. Anywho, how do you see your queerness kind of show up in your work in education?
Yeah. So to go back a little bit, I started my career as a classroom teacher. I was a high school level English teacher. I taught in Oklahoma and in Texas. Texas is where I'm from, where I mostly grew up because, again, I moved around a lot, but I was there the longest period of time in my childhood. So it's home to me. And so I taught in Oklahoma and Texas, and then I also taught abroad in Ecuador and Costa Rica. So I have like a very varied perspective on education just from my background. But started out as a high school level English teacher. I taught 9th and 11th grade. And I really loved it, but it took such a toll on my mental health that I was basically forced to leave the classroom because it was not sustainable for me mentally to continue doing it. And education is my passion, and that's something that I always saw myself doing in some capacity. I didn't think at the beginning of my career that I was going to be, a 30 plus year teacher. I just didn't see that for myself, but I knew that I always wanted to be involved in education in some capacity because I understand the power of education, and that has been something that has been there my whole life. And so I think a part of that too, though, is that I wasn't able to be out when I was teaching in any of the circumstances in which I was teaching. I wasn't able to be out as queer and then later as trans. And so that was took a big toll on my mental health because I wasn't able to be myself. I wasn't able to share my life with my students in the way that I wanted to, in the way that my colleagues could. I couldn't talk about my partner at the time. I couldn't talk about, different aspects of my identity. And that was really kind of soul crushing to me because I wanted to be so authentic with my students because that's what I valued so much in so many of my teachers that I had growing up, is like knowing who they were as people first, and then as my teacher. And I wasn't really able to fully do that with my students. And it was really, really difficult for me mentally to deal with that, basically go into work every day and go back into the closet. And no one should have to do that. And no one should have to take parts of themselves and hide them away and then, live their real lives outside of work. Like that should never be what happens. And so after leaving the classroom, I went to grad school. I studied international education, ended up coming out as trans and going through my social and medical transition. And I knew I wanted to stay in education in some capacities. I moved to Tanzania for a little bit, and that kind of was the catalyst for me coming out as trans. I was like, whoa, this is such a patriarchal society and like very homophobic and just like a lot of different things. So I ended up leaving there earlier than anticipated. And that was the catalyst really for my transition. But I was doing teacher training there with an NGO. And then I ended up coming back to the US and working for an after school program, which I still work for, and also, started my business earlier this year. And I primarily work with schools on LGBTQ plus inclusion, and with queer teachers. And that is like my heart and soul on a platter. Like that's what I want to be doing, with my life is making spaces more inclusive for kids that were like me, who didn't really understand their identity, or even kids that do understand their identity at younger ages, because we're seeing that more and more often now, because they have the vocabulary, they have the visibility, and all of these things. And so I enjoy helping others cultivate those spaces and really make those spaces, identity safe spaces. And then also working with queer teachers, because I was a queer teacher and I understand the difficult nature of that. And it's even more difficult now because of the circumstances happening, in the US with anti-trans legislation and book banning and all of these different things, all these different, laws that are being passed and things like that. So I really wanted to create spaces where communities of queer teachers could come together. And as you mentioned earlier, I facilitate a cohort for queer teachers. It's a 4-month-long cohort. This is the first one I've ever done, but I look forward to it so much. And like our little group is just like my little family, it feels like. And I just love being able to be in community with you all. And it's definitely something that I want to continue to do in the future and have, more spaces like that, and potentially do retreats or, conferences or things like that where we can all gather, because a big thing that has come out of the cohorts is that there's just not places for connection for queer teachers. There's not places where we can all gather together and talk about our experiences and troubleshoot and, all these different things that we really, really need. Because I know I didn't have that when I was a teacher, and I'm still hearing from people now that there aren't spaces like that. So I really am glad that I'm able to facilitate those spaces, and I want to keep doing that in bigger and bolder ways moving forward. But yeah, I don't think I answered your question, or maybe I did, but
you did.
It got lost somewhere in there.
I mean, the reality of the situation is that our queerness is a part of us, and so it shows up in everything that we do.
Totally.
You touched on like other questions as well, so we'll kind of navigate through that in a bit. I had an interview earlier this season with like Lynn's Amer from Queer Kids Stuff, and they were asking me, what is it that people can do? Like, what can my organization do to help queer teachers? And I was like, what's lacking is queer community, like queer teacher communities. They don't really exist. And like, I'm a part of an NEA, LGBTQ, I don't think it's a cohort, something else, but it's part of the National Education Association. And it's like a newsletter with like updates about laws. And I'm like, well, that's just like HRC and all those other nonprofit organizations where there actually isn't a sense of community. So I love what you're doing, because you do get to connect with people and talk about things that are relevant to what people are experiencing in the moment. And so let's dive a little bit into kind of like, in your own experience, you had mentioned that there's kind of this covert anti-queer behavior, in the sense that like you did not feel empowered to be yourself in any of your school settings. Were there other instances of anti-queer behavior that you witnessed as an educator when you were working in public schools, or even now that you are working as a freelance educational like consultant? Do you experience that as you're going through your work now? Totally.
Yeah. I mean, I think a big part of previously when I was teaching, like the anti-queer behavior, like you said, it's like very covert. It's not even like someone's saying homophobic things to me or transphobic things to me on a day-to-day basis or anything like that. It's very like in what people think, or subtle, microaggressive behaviors and things like that. I remember when I was teaching, I had like a picture at the time of my my partner at the time and I on my desk. And I remember a student like picking it up one time and being like, who is this? And I just was like, my heart just sank because I was like, I don't even know what to say, because I'm so afraid that if I tell the truth in this moment and I say who this person is to me, that like parents are going to be upset and they're going to be writing to the school because their kids are going to come home and tell them that, their teacher is queer and all this stuff, or administration's going to find out and then I'm going to be punished in some way for that, or fired, or, we hear these things all the time, teachers being fired for having a pride flag in their classroom, or, reading a book with, a queer character in it, or, things like that. And even, years ago when I was teaching, those fears were still there. But it was definitely very covert in the way that those things were happening to me. And a lot of it was just me not wanting to lose my job, and not wanting to have to face that, covert or overt hate, in any way, shape, or form as a teacher and as a human. So that's definitely, I didn't really have anything that was like super like pointed, but definitely, people asking me questions about who I was dating and things like that, which like I had to lie about, or like, things like that. So I definitely didn't have anything really pointed. But I did have students that, I always say this because I think it's true, but like queer students can tell that you're queer, like they know, and so I definitely had queer and trans students that like, I think knew, but they didn't say anything, and they were, they could recognize, that I was uncomfortable in that setting to be able to like speak on those things. So there were definitely queer students that knew I was queer, but they knew that I wasn't able to talk about it there, because probably they're also dealing with that in different ways. But in my work now, especially in working with schools, and especially working this year specifically with schools, there has been a number of schools that I've started working with, and they hire me to do a workshop with their teachers, or they hire me to, come in and work with them on policies and procedures for, name changes or things like that for their students, or even talking to parents about gender. And we'll start working together, and then things start to get closer and closer to the workshop, and then they want to change things. They're like, actually, can we talk about belonging? Actually, can we talk about these other things? And it's like, that's all very important too. I also do workshops on belonging and anti-racism in the classroom, and, different things like to work on LGBTQ stuff. And then you're like last minute wanting to change the complete topic of everything we're talking about. There's this fear around it, and they don't want to offend me, because they know like I'm queer and trans, and I'm very open about that with my clients. And they don't want to offend me by saying we're uncomfortable talking about this, or the parents are going to be uncomfortable that we had this training, or we're scared about libs of TikTok, or we're scared about, these different groups that are publishing the names of schools on their website that are doing these trainings, or that are talking about these topics, or implementing these policies and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of fear, and I've experienced that firsthand with people being like, actually, can we switch things? And I've even had people full on cancel contracts with me, specifically this year, because there is so much fear around doing the right thing, unfortunately. And it really breaks my heart, because it's when they're canceling these things and they're changing things last minute and divesting from what they originally wanted to work on, it's only disadvantaging their students. At the end of the day, and the queer teachers that exist there, and all of those groups. So it's been hard to navigate, especially this year for some reason. It's really, I think, getting closer to the election year has been difficult, and, all of the hate that's cropping up and all of that, like, I think, it's just made things really difficult for schools. And I understand, but I also sometimes wish schools would just forget about all that and do what's best for their students, because it's not only benefiting their LGBTQ plus students, but it's benefiting all of their students, to create more inclusive environments and have these policies in place in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely, because I struggle with this idea of like, we want to change, we're going to make changes, and then we're going to have it a complete about face. I experienced that at a school district that I worked for, and it was really disheartening because I thought that the school was headed in a good direction. And it's funny because we moved, and that school has a reputation where it is of being like the place to go. But like, since this about face that they've taken, their like great schools rating keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. And I'm just like, here's the thing about inclusion. Everybody benefits. And when you are making statements and when you are making choices that exclude, then people will take notice, and it's going to impact all the other areas of your schooling. It's not just going to impact the social side of school. It's going to impact the academic side, because if people don't feel included, they are going to disengage. When they disengage, you're going to see that show up in academics.
Totally. 100%.
I have a conference I'll be teaching at in November where I was basically told, and this episode airs in February, so I have a conference that I taught at in November for all of you who are listening. But this conference, when I sent in my original description, they loved everything about it except its queerness. And they're like, is there a way for us to talk about identity and be more inclusive, or change the wording so that everybody knows what you mean, but like, can we just change the wording so that way it doesn't, because they were worried literally about that kind of social media attack happening. And nonprofit organizations, like, to some extent, I understand that it can make or break your business. But I also think that if you're a nonprofit organization who's focused on developing strong values in people, you need to stand up and show that you have strong values. So ultimately, I ended up changing the whole thing and just said, like, great, why don't I come and just talk about identity then, and not focus on this one thing, which is fine, and I'm okay doing it. I'll just make that one thing a part of it. Because I think there's more to be said about identity in the classroom in general, and I'm okay with that. But it's super frustrating to me that like queer people are so taboo that we can't even show up on like one course offering at a 3-day conference.
I know.
Without a huge blow up happening.
Yeah, and I mean it's ridiculous, and it's becoming more pervasive. I'm seeing it at conferences too, because I also speak at conferences, and I'm seeing that and seeing people asking the same thing, like, can you just make it about inclusion? Or, and it's like, I can, but do I want to do that? No. I want to talk about queerness. I want to talk about, how amazing it is to have queer students, and how amazing it is that there are queer teachers that work at your school, and what that, being like loud and proud about how inclusive you are and that you're doing these things. Like, what an amazing way to show your students like how much you care about who they are. And it's really disheartening. And I don't think it's going to be something that stops anytime soon, just because of how vitriolic, the world is right now. But it is extremely disheartening, and again, only hurting the students when, they're not all in on these things like they should be.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about your business. What is your goal for your business? Like, what do you want people? What is the change you hope to make?
Yeah. So I think, what I spoke about a little bit earlier is that I want to do what I love every day. And for me, that is working in education, that is working to make spaces more inclusive, specifically for LGBTQ plus students, but also for everyone, and to work with queer teachers, because I want to be able to create spaces that I didn't have access to throughout my life. So I want to do what I love every day. And for me, that is working in education, that is working to make spaces more inclusive, specifically for LGBTQ plus students, but also for everyone, and to work with queer teachers, because I want to be able to create spaces that I didn't have access to throughout my life. So as a student, as a queer student, and then also as a queer teacher and a trans teacher, I didn't have those communities and those spaces to be able to gather and be in community with people that were having similar experiences to me. So for me, Empowered for Equity is about empowering people to create these spaces that are more inclusive and helping people cultivate the tools that they need in order to do that. Because when I work with schools, a lot of the time, there are teachers that are really invested in doing this, and in, making sure that they know all of their students' pronouns, and they, have a policy in their classroom for if a student comes to them and says, I want to change my name. I want you to call me this name from now on. And I also, as a queer teacher, this was pre coming out as trans, I had trans students that didn't know how to communicate with me about those things. I could sense that they maybe wanted to talk about these things, but also I was uneducated at the time. As somebody who was queer, I didn't fully understand gender until a little bit later. And I didn't start really diving into that a little bit later. So, and, some of the schools I worked at didn't have policies for these types of things. And so there are a lot of gaps that need to be filled in that way. So I also work with nonprofits that serve youth. So after school programs, summer camps, things like that. Because I do feel like there's a real need in youth spaces for this kind of, inclusion training, because we're just seeing so many more kids at younger ages really understanding their gender in different ways, again, because of visibility and because of, having the language and things like that now. So it's really vital and it's really needed that we have, this kind of training available to people, because if not, that's going to force kids back into the closet. That's going to do sometimes irreparable damage, psychologically to students or children who are, facing difficult situations at home, and things like that. You and I both know that, having supportive adults in a child's life, whether that's a teacher, an after school program staff member, or a coach on your team or whatever, or a parent or a caregiver of some sort, is vital to so many aspects of development for children. And so I want to be able to impact how many, adults we have out there that can take on that role, in a way that is not damaging to LGBTQ plus youth. Because it's really good to educate and it's great to have the knowledge, but it's all about what you do with that knowledge. So it's great if you know what LGBTQ plus stands for, but if you're not applying that to what you're doing in life, then, you're not doing anything with the tools that you have, and the knowledge that you have. So for me, it's all about empowering that action and being active, in ways that they can shape spaces specifically, because I think it's pretty amazing that as teachers, we have the ability to cultivate space. We get to say, this is what flies in my classroom and this is what doesn't. These are the things that are really important to me as a teacher and in cultivating this space for my students. And I think that's an amazing privilege to have, but some teachers haven't had training and don't have the education in, how to do that. So for me, my business is really rooted in what I didn't have, and making ways and spaces for others like me to have those things.
Absolutely. There's a lot that you just mentioned that's just gotten me like spiraling into a bunch of side quests, but I'm going to try to focus myself here. One thing that you mentioned was just like, it's great that you know what the acronym means, but it means nothing if you're not putting that stuff into action. And it's funny because the only reason I'm going to this conference, or that I went to this conference in the metaverse that I'm living in at the moment, is because I teach lessons at my schools that I work in that center on, it's not enough to know what a value statement means. It has to be put into action, and like teaching young people, whether they're in elementary, middle school, or high school, how to take a value like humility or perseverance or whatever your school's values are, and put them into action. Because I watch my children memorize these really cute songs that teach them these words and what they mean, but they have no idea how to display it.
Yeah.
And like, it's great that you know that integrity means doing the right thing when nobody's looking. How do you do that? Like, what do you have to do within yourself to do that? And so it's interesting because I have that same kind of like teaching method when it comes to values that you're talking about when it comes to specifically like working with the queer community. The other thing I wanted to jump into is that you want to work with queer teachers, and say you're working with a queer teacher who is going into education, they're just getting started, and they are unsure how to show up authentically in their educational space. But like, you had explained that, you knew you weren't going to be a 30-year teacher. Maybe this teacher believes they're going to be a 30-year teacher.
Yeah.
So like, what advice do you give to them about going into the classroom and trying to show up authentically?
Yeah, I think I would tell them to do what feels right for them. I think sometimes in the queer community in general, I think there is pressure sometimes to be out and proud, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But I think that especially in the world that we're living in right now, you have to protect your peace, like at all costs, as a teacher, but also as a human. And I think that it's great to be that visibility for your students and to be out and proud in your classroom. But I think that also you have to remember your safety, and you have to remember, that this, especially if it's a long-term career for you, that you have to think about years down the road what that's going to mean for you. So I think, although it's awesome to be out and proud and, to really show up in that authentic way, I think there's a lot to think about. You have to think about many different things now. And I wish we didn't have to. I really wish that we could just be who we are, and it wouldn't matter. But there's a lot of different factors that come into play. And I think just do what feels right for you. If you feel comfortable, first week of school, talking to your students about it, if you, feel it out the first couple days and you're like, okay, I feel comfortable, then like, great, more power to you. But it's also okay to like take a year to get settled and get adjusted in your school and really find who your allies are there, and who you can confide in. But also, like, it's okay to not be out. It's okay to not, it's not like something that's damaging to you, in your career if you choose to not be out from the jump. Like, you can ease into it. It doesn't have to be all in at once, and it doesn't have to be from the very first day, or you feel like you can't do it. You can spread it out. It doesn't have to be all at once. Everybody knows. And it can be that way too, if you want it to be, but I think it's just important to think about lots of different factors, but also realize that it's okay to ease into it. It doesn't have to be all at once. You can kind of feel things out and see. And also that like your experience could be completely different at a different school. I think that's something that like no one really told me when I first started teaching, like how different your experience can be as a teacher from district to district and school to school. Because I had very different experiences, even from Texas and Oklahoma, which like are not that different culturally. So I had very different experiences in the expectations of teachers and just different things there. So also realize that like you might not be at this school forever, and that there will be maybe other opportunities for you to be authentic in the way you want to be down the road, or, you know, next year even, or in a few months or whatever. But I think ultimately it's your decision and you shouldn't have to feel forced to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a couple of things that have happened in the interview that I think are worth like noting that you've mentioned. The first one is that you mentioned that you were a queer teacher and you had transgender students and you weren't sure like how to help them with the questions that they needed to ask yourself and other teachers, or like how to approach that conversation. And so that's one thing I want to say to educators out there, especially queer educators, is that there's this expectation that you will be able to be that person, like the encyclopedia of all things queer, and that you're going to be able to get every conversation and every situation correct. And I just want to let you know that it's okay if you don't, and it's okay if you don't have all that information, because I feel I can like think of a handful of queer related conversations that I've had with high school students where I was like, I could have handled that better. And I was, you know, specifically sought out because I was the queer person, the out queer person. And I think it's also okay to be a queer person who does not feel the need to wave the banner and be the savior of all queer people, because you have to do what makes you feel comfortable. And that's kind of like where I see this last response going, is that like ultimately it really comes down to you and your comfort, and knowing that like being a 30-year teacher doesn't mean being a 30-year teacher at this school. There are lots of opportunities that may approach in the future, and especially for those of us who are like, you know, millennials who consistently change jobs, or stereotypically change jobs. There's lots of opportunity for us, so like look around, you might find a place that's perfect. I'm intrigued to know, or I'm excited for this next question, because it seems like it's right in your wheelhouse. And that is, what do you think that school communities can do to be more inclusive to us LGBTQ plus people?
I think the answer to this is part of what we've talked about in the cohort that you know I'm facilitating and that you're, you know, a participant in, is that we need community. We need spaces to gather, and that's not just, you know, like you said, a newsletter, or, you know, mentioning that it's National Coming Out Day, or, you know, of course those things are important, but that's not what builds a community. I think that specifically districts could do a lot more in terms of supporting queer teachers and queer students. But I have also had the opportunity to work with some districts here in Maryland. I'm in the Baltimore area. Some independent schools that have a conference every year specifically for queer teachers. They have a conference specifically for queer students and all students to come to, that's centered around inclusion, specific to LGBTQ plus inclusion. And I think that that's a great example of ways that, you know, this could be handled. Of course, one conference is not going to change everything, but I think that it's important to include everybody in this conversation, and to really help rally everyone around this type of inclusion. So I think that that's one thing, is just creating more space for beyond GSAs or beyond affinity groups or things like that. Those are great. But I think there are a lot of other opportunities out there that schools are just not taking advantage of. But I also think something you talked about earlier is that like you shouldn't expect queer teachers to know the answer to everything that has to do with queerness. And that's also why you should hire consultants like me, because then you're taking the burden off of your queer teachers to do the education of, your entire staff about what it means to be queer and what it means to be a teacher. I have dealt with that a lot in a lot of different workplaces that I've worked in. I've been the only trans person in quite a few places that I've worked. And anytime someone has an unsolicited question about what something trans, they, come to me and they want me to, give them the answer to the question or talk them through whatever. And it puts a huge burden on that person, on the staff to the staff member or the teacher or whatever to educate. And that's not our job to do that. So that's why more schools should hire consultants like me, so that I can do the educating instead of having that burden be put on, staff that happen to fall into these communities. And that goes for LGBTQ plus community, the Black community, different, ethnicities and race communities. Like this happens, to anybody in that way. So I think that's another step, is just really not being afraid to be bold about inclusion, and specifically queer inclusion, and things that maybe might seem scary right now to talk about. But I think it's so vital that we talk about these things with staff, but also with students. I think it's incredibly important. And I'm just not seeing a lot of push for that right now. So that's the third thing, is just, making sure that you are doing the work and putting these things into action. And it's not just, we have one workshop one time and that's it. This is a continuing process. It's not something you can just, okay, well, now I know everything about, what it means to be queer because one person came and did an 1.5-hour workshop. Or I went to a conference and I, sat in on a session that was about identity. Now I know everything about that. I don't need to do any more work. So I think really, truly being an ally means, putting that into action, the knowledge that you're getting. So I think all of those things are very important. And I think at the crux of what all of that is action. It's not just, having one, not sending out an email once a year that says like Happy Pride Month. It's a much deeper thing than that. And it has to be consistent. Your action has to be consistent. That's another part that I try to really stress when I work with schools, is like, this has to be a consistent thing. It can't just be one time you do it this way and the next time you handle it a different way. It really needs to become part of your practice as a school, as a teacher, as an administrator. But I think action is the bottom line of all of this. You have to do something with the knowledge that you have.
Absolutely. And if someone wanted to hire a consultant like yourself, how would they go about finding you?
Yeah, so they can find consultants in a lot of different ways. I'm talking about you specifically. Oh, so me specifically. Is your
opportunity. Okay. Free commercial.
Yay. Okay. Thanks for the plug. So if they wanted to find me, there are a couple different ways they can do that. One of which is go to my website, which is www.empoweredforequity.com, and book a discovery call with me. It's very easy. There's a big button on my website that says book a call with me, and you can do that. And my email is also on my website, so you could just also reach out via email. My social media is pretty poppin'. I usually post on there when I am accepting new clients. I do anything from single, workshops an hour. I do full day workshops with schools. I do speaking engagements. I work with GSAs, doing workshops for queer kids at, GSAs and affinity groups. But a lot of my bookings actually come from word of mouth, mostly word of mouth in Maryland, just because I've worked with, quite a few Maryland schools. And so what happens with that is I'll do a workshop somewhere, and then, usually the DEI director or principal or whoever I've been working with will talk to their friends and say, hey, we had this really great workshop. You should think about hiring SJ for a workshop at your school, or to, work on a longer term project, because I also work on, strategic planning support, and things like that. So I've had contracts go for 2 years, and things like that. So, there are definitely different ways that my name gets put out there, but the main way is really just, finding me on social media, which my Instagram handle is @EmpoweredForEquity. You can also find me on LinkedIn. It's just my name, SJ Janjua. You can search that. But yeah, those are the ways to get in contact with me. I'm also part of this collective that's called Co-Creative, or Learning Co-Created is what it's called. And it's basically a platform for administrators and teachers to find people who do professional development. And there are all kinds of different topics on there. There's a couple people who do LGBTQ plus inclusion stuff. There are some people that do anti-racism training for schools. There's people that do, how to integrate STEM and like ed tech and all these different things on there. But it's basically a marketplace for administrators and teachers to go on there and say, hey, this person looks like they, did a workshop on this really creative thing, and I want to bring them to my school. It's called Learning Co-Created. You can just Google that. And I'm a person on there that you can book through there, and you can just message me on there. But it's great. I want to plug that because it's an amazing resource, and I don't think that many people know about it. But there are a lot of great consultants on there that do really amazing work. So it's a great place to find PD opportunities.
Perfect. I love that. Thank you for all the resources. I'll make sure those are in the show notes.
Awesome.
At this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and you have the opportunity to ask me a question. So take it away.
Awesome. I think my question is, what do you think needs to happen in order to create safer school environments for queer kids and queer teachers?
I think that there needs to be more descriptive, definitive language in laws. Mm. Currently, when it comes to workplace rights for LGBTQ people, gender identity and sexual orientation fall under sex discrimination, equated to like, does a woman get paid the same or less than a man, in that kind of category. And I think that there needs to be more definitive language that says that, like disability and age and race and sex and class, that gender identity and sexual orientation are definitive protected classes, and that information and that language needs to also be applied to Title IX to apply to school settings. And here's the thing, folks, like the Civil Rights Act in 1964 is what I'm talking about, and that's where Title VII comes in, and that's what protects people from getting fired because of who they are, right? And so there were Supreme Court cases several years ago that made it illegal to fire people just for being queer. And that's really fantastic, but there are loopholes to it because it goes through a Supreme Court case, right? The government needs to stand up and take a stand and say that this is the definitive language and we are protecting these people. Once that happens, I think that it will be easier for school districts to implement protective measures for LGBTQ people, because the fear is, especially in places like Texas, that like literally the government's going to come after you if you are protecting queer people, because the government is saying we're going to come after you if you're protecting queer people. And so if we have these laws set in place that are definitive and clear, because as Brene Brown says, clear is kind, then we will be at a place where then local rules can be definitive and clear and more protection can take place. Beyond that, I think you're absolutely correct in that every child and every teacher needs to know that there's a space for them and a community for them to be in. And I've been that one queer teacher or one out queer teacher in the past. And it is a very lonely road, and you still find your people. But it is different than finding your people. And so I think that there are lots of us that are kind of working towards this. And my philosophy in watching like queer groups specifically in areas that I've lived in where they're all trying to do the same thing, but none of them are working together, is that like organizations need to come together and create space together. And so like, how do we make that happen? Because having a community, a cohort working through you, and then also another community here and another community here. Well, it's great to have all these communities, but like we only have so much time. And what if we could all better utilize our resources by working together? And so I think that like from a nonprofit organization perspective, and that it would behoove people to work together to create these communities that are so necessary. Because like, I mean, in the educational setting, there are full-on Black colleges. In the educational setting, there are religious schools. There are lots of communities that are being created for specific people. And we shouldn't be different. So that's it. That's what I got.
It's a pretty lofty goal, but I think it's completely possible. I think everything you said is possible. And I think that I'm going to start to think about how I can work with others now, more just thinking about what you just said, like how I can work more with others who are also trying to move in this direction. Especially, with the future cohorts and, things like that, because I'm sure there are others that are wanting to do similar things or, have done similar things. But as one person, I only have so much capacity, so it would be great to have a team of people to work with. So anybody out there that's listening, if you are interested in that, let me know. And let's see how we can collaborate and work together towards making this a more solid thing in the lives of many people that really need it.
Ooh, I put myself on mute. Yes, absolutely. So I just, I want to echo that in that, like, I will join you in that and we will have a side conversation some other time about it.
Totally.
But I also want to thank you for your time being on the podcast today. I've really enjoyed our time working together and also our time just getting to sit and chat and know you a little bit better today.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
It was my pleasure. And thank you all for listening at home. I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Teaching While Queer. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Leave a review, and that would help out tremendously. You can also support the podcast by going to www.teachingwhilequeer.com and hit support the show. Thanks so much, and have a great day.